what would be the best option for a claims adjuster or an injured individual who's considering this plethora of alternative modalities that they may not have considered in their periphery of treatment options? I mean, what can they do? Because I imagine a young adjuster is going to be like, oh my gosh, like just calling a nurse case manager, like I don't even know what to provide to this person. What are some things to consider and think about?
Well, I think a medical director, nurse case manager, chief clinical officer, someone like that has the scientific background in order to test the veracity of the promises or guarantees in some cases made by the different vendors. So, I don't think it's up to the claims adjuster to go, okay, here's 47,000 different options that we can provide for this injured worker. That is actually malpractice.
Welcome to It's Settled, the Amitros podcast. Each episode, we're going to dig into the humanity in workers' compensation and insurance claims, exploring the stories of injured people and those who support them, as well as the good work professionals are doing in the industry. And now, I invite you to join me, Sean Dean, General Counsel at Amitros and the host of It's Settled. Now, it's settled. Let's get on to the episode. We are doing a podcast with the RX professor himself, Mr. Mark Pugh. Couldn't be more excited to have him on. My name is Sean Dean. I'm general counsel here at Amitros. I'm also the host of the It's Settled podcast. And just by way of background, one of our first podcasts last year, I had on Claire Musselman. And we talked about a ton of stuff. Loved having her on. Love Claire. She's such an amazing, powerful force, positive force within the work comp industry. And we got talking about mentorship. And it came around to me asking her who her biggest mentor and positive influence was. And she mentioned you, Mark. So I went, absolutely. That totally makes sense. I've known you for many years. And you're such a great person, and so incredibly intelligent about many facets of the workers' compensation industry, and certainly out front with a lot of ideas that are probably ahead of their time. Certainly a trendsetter within the work comp industry. And we went, oh my gosh, have to have Mark on. So Mark, welcome to the podcast. Really great to have you.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Sean. Now that my ego is completely inflated, it's all downhill from here. But Claire's been a good friend for a long time. You and I have known each other for a long time as well, and so the full circle is always a great way to kind of get started.
It's a great way to get started, and I think a great way for us to get started for folks who don't know you and are listening in. I guess don't go back, too far. I've known you for years, and I can tell by your accent you're not from New York or Minnesota. But tell us kind of where you grew up, and I guess maybe your background that brought you into the workers' compensation industry. A lot of folks I talk to, work comp kind of found them. And I think folks' career trajectories are all different, but would love to hear your story about how you got into workers' compensation.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version, or else we won't have any other content to talk about.
Yeah.
I was born in Illinois, spent some time in California, moved to Atlanta in 1967. So I'm kind of a mongrel when it comes to cultural appropriation and how I speak. Although sometimes when I listen to recordings, I'm trying to figure out how Jed Clampett got on there. I sound really, really badly Southern, but I try not to. I got into comp. To your point, it selected me as opposed to me selecting it. I had worked for Equifax and ChoicePoint for about 20 years from a technical standpoint. And about 10 years in, one of my members of my team had gotten tired of doing nights and weekends, doing software development on case management software for a company called Professional Reviews, which turned into Priam, which ultimately was bought by Gen X and then now part of Enlight. And so I started doing nights and weekends developing software, and you can't write software without really knowing what solution, what the problem is. And so I had to understand workers' comp. I had to understand utilization review and utilization management process. I had to understand the concept of treatment guidelines. And through that process, became really intrigued by it to the point that after I went through Y2K with ChoicePoint, I joined Priam full time. And in 2003, I noticed a lot of overprescribing of opioids that were coming across in a lot of the reviews that we were doing. And so I took kind of those software development skills and applied them to product development and say, hey, we've been doing UR. Should we do something specifically about pharmacy? And obviously, it wasn't just the opioids, it's the benzodiazepines, the somas, the stool softeners, the, help me get to sleep, help me wake up, all those different drugs. And so I created a program called the Physician Pharmacy Review, which was specifically focused on just talking about the drugs. And we submitted and won an award for it, Innovation Award, shortly thereafter. And then in 2012, I got the first opportunity to kind of get out in front of public and talk about what I had learned. I'm not a clinician, never adjudicated a claim, not an attorney. All those things that when people hear me speak, they kind of assume that I have that background because I speak with a level of authority and credibility. And that authority and credibility really comes from hanging out really smart people like Claire, like you, like great doctors around the country, nurses, attorneys, you name it. I've had meals with them. I've been spoken on panels and prepared for them. I've sat in audiences and listened to them. And all of that has kind of been assimilated into my brain and kind of my own version of the intersection of chronic pain and appropriate treatment, which has been kind of my calling card from the very beginning. And so, if you were to look back in, 1990, when I first started doing the consulting, and fast forward and tell me that in 2022, I would have 650 presentations and 65,000 people under my belt and have a YouTube channel and be viewed as a thought leader on medical cannabis or biopsychosocial treatment plans or opioids, I would have told you that you were definitely smoking something, because that was definitely not anything on my horizon. But I've been adaptable and just, have taken opportunities as they have arisen.
Yeah. And so, not to inflate your ego anymore, and I'm not blowing smoke, and I'm not trying to use any unintentional puns, but I met you a decade ago, and I saw you speak at a conference. You may or may not remember speaking at it. You spoke at a conference in Florida. It was a NAMSAP conference in Orlando in 2012. And I went, oh my gosh, this guy is the most articulate, on point, entertaining, engaging public speaker on this subject I've ever seen. And not only that, you were delivering a message that needed to be delivered. It seemed like no one was talking about this stuff. And myself, coming from a Medicare set-aside background, where all day we were looking at these allocations that included these prescription drug regimens that we weren't really thinking in regards to the benefit of the individual. We were thinking, okay, we need to get in there what CMS is going to want to see. And you came along and went, hey, there's a better way. And then it really, I think your philosophy helped turn the tides for a lot of folks thinking about this stuff. And certainly for me, it was a big impact when I was involved with NAMSAP, now the MSPN. Some folks and I really pushed CMS to take a hard look at these Medicare set-aside allocations and the frequently abused drugs that were included in them. And I guess, was it a matter of necessity, or was it like this altruistic thing, or was it just, hey, we're trying to do some cost mitigation, but you started picking up on either frequency and dosage or a combination of drugs that you knew weren't beneficial long-term for the individual? Like what steered you into this area that became kind of your calling card, raising that red flag?
Well, I guess a little bit of all of the above. I'm a preacher's kid, which is one reason why I've born in Illinois, lived in California, moved to the Atlanta area. So I come at things from a maybe a little different angle because I and my son was an Eagle Scout, and so I've been almost trained as a youngster, as an adult, to leave the world a better place, whether that be a campground, campfire setting, or just in general, kind of the world in part. And so, and I think logically, I come from an IT background. So I think in terms of ones and zeros and, sequence of events. I also don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe that the path that I have been on that has been marked with a variety of U-turns and roundabouts, which you're very familiar with in Massachusetts, and, all those different things. There's not a coincidence. All of those things, those people, those events, the things that I saw, that I read, have all contributed to who I am right now. So the epiphany for me in 2003 really was an amalgamation of different things. Number one, obviously, I was employed by a company that was selling services, and we needed to, pay the bills. So looking for some form of differentiation that really wasn't there. There were a couple of competitors at that time and looking specifically at pharmacy, but not very many, and certainly not big players in the industry. But then as I got into it, and I recognized the fact this wasn't just a product development, but this was a quality of life. This was an efficacy of outcome. This was, people that were actually getting harmed by the treatment that was being provided to them. And by virtue of that, the reason why I came to that conclusion is that I would go out to California, I would go out to Oregon, I would go out to Texas, and I would take 2 suitcases with me. One was with my clothes, and one was empty to start with, and came back with, and don't tell anybody from a HIPAA standpoint, but that second suitcase was filled with pieces of paper that I had photocopied, that I had extracted staples from, and it had read the initial first report of injury, that I had read the initial surgical report, that I had read diagnostic reports, that I had read IMEs and progress reports. And it was just amazing to me because I was involved in it because there was someone who was on this egregiously intense drug regimen that by all intents, if you just read the label on the drug bottle, much less the progress reports, you could see that this was not good for them. And then if you reverse engineered and went back to it, you could almost see that it wasn't necessarily benign injury, but it wasn't an injury that would have incurred this kind of drug regimen and this kind of lack of function and lack of capability of going back to work, lack of the ability to settle. You never would have predicted that from the original injury, from the original surgery, et cetera. So, I started piecing those things together well before the CDC talked about the dangers of mixing benzodiazepines and opioids. I was on that because I saw it purely from a logical standpoint, from a quality of life standpoint. It just didn't make sense that you continued to see this dose escalation, that you continued to see these additional drugs come in that wouldn't necessarily be there. So, one of my epiphanies was a Super Bowl several years ago where the opioid-induced constipation drug was introduced to the entire population of the world. And I almost threw my remote at the TV. It's like, okay, let's deconstruct this. Opioid-induced constipation. The constipation is being induced by the opioid. So rather than throwing another drug at it, why don't we reduce or remove the opioids that's inducing the constipation? So it was this whole mindset that if this didn't work, then we throw another drug. We increase the dosage. We increase the number of times they take the drugs. We see the increased symptomatology, and so we're throwing additional drugs at it. And so in looking at all that, it was just from a logical standpoint, it's like, this absolutely doesn't make sense. And so that's when I started reading treatment guidelines and started reading and understanding and talking with our physicians at Priam, started, interacting with other folks and started consolidating this picture. It's like, this doesn't make sense. Here's the logic for why it doesn't make sense. And then I was given the opportunity in Phoenix in February of 2012 for my very first presentation. And I look at the PowerPoint now, it's like, oh my God, everything that you should not do on a PowerPoint is what I did, because I had no confidence. I had no credibility. I was just this random Georgia redneck that had an opinion on the best practices of opioids. in front of 50 nurses. And so fortunately the podium wasn't see-through, so they couldn't see my knees knocking throughout the presentation. But I spoke to it. And I had this nurse came up to me afterwards and said, "You're the best speaker I've ever heard on this particular subject." And I'd say, "Well, I appreciate that. You obviously need to get out more." But I appreciate that. But she gave me the encouragement. She kind of became a groupie, and she got me involved in other CEs. And through that process, I had conversations with people that informed my opinion on things. I was a biomedical kind of a approach, and then the concept of cognitive behavioral therapy came through. Not a lot of people wanted to incur that because they felt like it was going to open Pandora's box for everything that has happened to them since they were a child. And voila, the logic is that everything that has happened to them up to their life to the point is impacting their resilience, impacting their ability or even desire to get better, and all those different things. So, I got into those conversations. Those conversations continued to inform my opinion, and my opinion changed, over time. And so, I've gotten better, I think, at being able to articulate my message, but it's also become more nuanced. It's also become more wide ranging. And that's why I think kind of my approach at the intersection of chronic pain and appropriate treatment sounds like a very finite niche, but in reality, it opens up to everything.
Yeah.
That potentially could, provide that.
Absolutely. Where do you see the current state of things? Because it seems to be, and this could be totally me. I seem to be seeing mixed messages. All these opioid lawsuits are starting to settle. Some of them with states and states attorneys generals. You're reading, or at least I'm reading articles about, it's tapering off. There's not as many instances of abuse and overdose, but then we hit the pandemic, and you see some studies that show abuse of prescription drugs and overdoses skyrocketing. I guess two-part question, and it's kind of dense. Where do you see and I don't even want to relegate it or limit it to opioids, but where do you see prescribed pain medication abuses today, and where do you also see trends within the workers' compensation prescribing arena? This is as someone who, I'm at Amitros. We manage post-settlement medical funds, and we're very acutely aware of things that our members are taking and concerned about their safety and welfare. So what are you seeing? What are the trends?
Well, if you look at all the drug trends reports from PBMs, the prescribing of opioids actually plateaued in 2014. And starting then, there has actually been double-digit decline year over year in opioid prescribing. At the same time, I think it was 2018 where California documented that the use of NSAIDs, prescription NSAIDs, actually exceeded the prescribing of opioids. So they were going in opposite directions. Opioids were declining, NSAIDs were increasing. Obviously, NSAIDs are good for anti-inflammatory. That's the A and the I as a part of that. But they really should be used very sparingly long term because they have issues for kidney and liver issues and gastric and gut issues associated with that. So they're not necessarily something you want to take for the next 36.7 years. Gabapentinoids, Lyrica, Neurontin, have historically been in the top 5, both mostly from a cost standpoint. Obviously, the pregabalin brand, or the pregabalin generic that came aboard about 2 years ago, has dampened that a little bit. But gabapentinoids have increased in use. But interestingly enough, they're Schedule 4 drugs in about 5 states at this point, and the UK put them in their Class C because they saw gabapentinoids were actually drugs of abuse. And the reason that how you see drugs of abuse is that you see that they have a high street value. And what the research was showing was that gabapentinoids used in addition to opioids, whether they be prescription opioids or heroin or fentanyl analogs, that they actually increased the euphoria. They actually created a bigger high. So you see the mixture of the gabapentinoids associated with that. You saw tramadol, increase in use. But interestingly enough, about 4 years ago, it was added, I believe, as a Schedule 4 drug, because if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably an opioid. And it was deemed as not narcotic, so it didn't need to be a scheduled drug. So, from a prescription standpoint, we've seen ebbs and flows. Obviously, the increase in use of antidepressants. By the way, gabapentinoid use is off-label for pain, so doctors are already using it contrary, which is totally okay. I mean, there's a lot of drugs that are used contrary to what the FDA approved it, but that is off-label. But you see a lot of use of antidepressants, drugs that are used not only for the depression but also for the pain. So there's this constant kind of search. In addition to states that enacted laws that said you can only prescribe 5-day supply, 3-day supply during acute pain standpoint. So, and doctors were seeing that the DEA and other entities were looking over their shoulder as far as their opioid prescribing patterns. So there were a lot of doctors that decided they weren't going to do opioids anymore. At the same time, patients were going, I don't want opioids, because they've been reading reading the newspaper. They've been seeing the stories of opioid addiction. Maybe they had suffered addiction or had a family friend that had gone through that. And started with a teenager. A number of stories that I heard for teenagers that had sports-related injuries and became connected to heroin because the doctors stopped prescribing the opioids that they had become tolerant, dependent, or even addicted to. And then the heroin killed them, or maybe they moved from the heroin to the analog fentanyl, which is actually the predominant killer now from an overdose standpoint. If you look at the statistics, phenylog analogs that are generally manufactured in China or Mexico and either shipped across the border or shipped even through USPS and cut and incorporated into marijuana, incorporated into cocaine, incorporated into fake Xanax pills. That's really what's killing most people now. It's not prescription opioids, it's the phenyl analogs. But oftentimes it started with the overprescribing and the tolerance, and then the dependence, and then the addiction on that. So, and that's one reason why, the intersection of chronic pain and appropriate treatment, why I've expanded my scope. I'm on the advisory board for Harvard MedTech, which provides virtual reality therapy for pain management, which is an up and coming. I've learned a lot about neuroplasticity. I've learned a lot about how important the brain is to managing pain and gait control theory and all those different things. And that's getting wider acceptance. In workers' comp, on the advisory board for Simple Therapy, which offers an artificial intelligence app associated with musculoskeletal pain and helps people get through that. I'm on the advisory board for Coldvitch Health, which provides nurse support during pre and post surgery, because if you do things right before the surgery and after the surgery, maybe you don't even need the opioids. And then I have an intense interest in medical cannabis. My very first blog post in 2014, and by the way, I was the first one to ever talk about medical cannabis and work.
I remember.
Medical cannabis was in air quotes. So I've evolved on that as well. So, you see all those things, psychotherapy, mindfulness, and meditate. I mean, there's just so many different ways to approach pain management. So, as the opioid spigot started to get turned off, there are a variety of people going, okay, what do we do now? We still got people in acute pain. We still got people in chronic pain. We can't cut them off cold turkey. How do we appropriately taper them off? What do we taper them to? Do we taper them to other prescription drugs? Do we taper them to non-pharmaceutical options? What do we do? So the industry, in my mind, over the past 3 or 4 years, really, as we have pivoted away from opioids, we have opened our mind to other things like acupuncture. Historically was deemed as not sufficient for Western medicine, but then CMS actually has approved reimbursement for acupuncture for certain so we've got to open our eyes, but at the same time, claims adjusters on the front line are presented with all sorts of options, with all sorts of their own evidence, whether it be anecdotal, random controlled trial, all this kind of stuff. And the claims adjusters go, it was really simple when we just prescribed opioids. I've got 7 billion different options. How do I sort through those? How do I figure out what's appropriate? Physicians, by the same token, historically, I've used injections, or I've gone to surgery maybe before the conservative options have been exhausted, or I literally just prescribed 30 days supply of OxyContin for maybe 3 days worth of pain that the OxyContin still wasn't, it was overkill for that as well. Now, what do I do? So we got this kind of wandering happening in the industry, and I think in healthcare in general, as opioids become passe, what are they replaced with? And it's great that we have a bunch of options, but it's one of those, you know, weird kind of blessings in disguise. A lot of options, but what do you do with those options? How do you separate the options? How do you choose which options are appropriate? And oh, by the way, at the same time, you've got individuals who are individuals. So not every tool works for every person. So they bring their own psychosocial baggage. They bring their own social determinants of health. They bring their own physical comorbidities. They bring their own history with prescription drugs. So all of this stuff is like, what do you do, in order to try to figure out? So in one way, it went from simple, let's just throw drugs at them, to a much more complicated nuance, which is the right approach. But now you really have to understand all the options that are available and really sort through the evidence to find what works for that individual at this particular time.
So what would be
way more than you expected? So I apologize. But
no, this is fantastic. So what would be and I don't even know if you can summarize it, but what would be the best option for a claims adjuster or an injured individual who's considering this plethora of alternative modalities that they may not have considered in their periphery of treatment options? I mean, what can they do? Because I imagine a young adjuster is going to be like, oh my gosh, like just calling a nurse case manager, like I don't even know what to provide to this person. What are some things to consider and think about?
Well, I think a medical director, nurse case manager, chief clinical officer, someone like that has the scientific background in order to test the veracity of the promises or guarantees in some cases made by the different vendors. So, I don't think it's up to the claims adjuster to go, okay, here's 47,000 different options that we can provide for this injured worker. That is actually malpractice in order to ask that claims adjuster to decide which of those medical. So I think there needs to be the medical vetting based on the science, based on logic, based on outcomes. In some cases, there may be 3 or 4 different options for different stages of pain. So how you treat acute pain is different than how you subacute pain, which is is different than you treat chronic pain. And chronic pain is different from someone who has just evolved into chronic pain and someone who's been in chronic pain for 15 years. So understanding what the appropriate options are for those different stages of pain, and doing your best to vet the science, to vet the evidence, maybe to do a pilot. There's a lot of people that have done pilots before, with definitive starts and ends. Well, how do you claim success? How do you measure this? How do you make it consistent? So it's almost like a random control trial within, this cohort of 15 injured workers for this particular, claim organization. Predictive analytics is really key now, using all of the demographic information, all the medical information, all this stuff that is in ones and zeros, which is the best form to figure that out, and to look at that and to look at history and to say, 97% of the time, someone with this particular demographic and this particular medical history, 97% of the time, this is the kind of treatment that worked. This is the kind of treatment that didn't work. Maybe it's 76% for option 2. Maybe it's 63% for option 3. And so you give all this information. So I don't think it's up to an individual to try to sort through that. I think a claims organization really needs to take the scientific approach and look at it and not just take the salesperson's promises, but to go 1 or 2 or 3 or 74 layers deep beyond the sales slick into, okay, what's the scientific background for this? Is there science that backs up the concept of what you're doing? Maybe not this specific product, but the concept of what you're doing. What's the science and the outcomes behind being able to deploy this? So I think it really needs to be thorough. It needs to be methodical. It needs to be science-based. And it needs to be something that's done, not presented to a claims adjuster who doesn't have the capability or the experience to do that, but by someone who's been there, done that, and has that scientific thought pattern that can really try to separate the wheat from the chaff.
This is great. It totally makes sense. I do want to Um, I do want to get in the weeds a little bit because
so to
you
speak.
referenced
Yeah.
the 2014 blog article. I remember reading it. I had known you for a couple years before then, and as you indicated, you were focused on primarily the opioid and frequently abused drug issues, and it was kind of out of nowhere for me. But you hit on something. I want to know what the light bulb moment was for you that caused you to pivot to focus on medical cannabis as an alternative modality to pain treatment, when, man, literally no one was talking about it. And I think it caught people by surprise. And this was before all the states started to fall and legalize either medicinal or recreational. I mean, no one was talking about it. And we kind of took everyone aback. And I think, I mean, now as I'm sitting here talking to you in 2022, you're probably like, I told you so. But what caused you to want to pave a path forward in this arena and get the word out?
Well, it was a part of my journey of evolution, of looking for other options, better for worse. I have been known in the industry for seeing trends and talking about them and doing something about them before before they become mainstream. And cannabis was certainly one of those. The epiphany for me was the New Mexico case that required reimbursement, and the logic behind the civil court decision that said it was because it was deemed reasonable and necessary, that comported with the work comp requirement for reimbursement, and that reasonable and necessariness was evaluated by a physician, and the story associated with it, where this individual was on this intense cocktail of prescription drugs, had not gotten much value out of them, had become to some degree dependent upon them. We overuse the term addicted, so I would lend more towards that dependence form. And he replaced them completely with medical cannabis. And so you read the story from the heart standpoint, it's like, okay, I've been talking about the dangers of these cocktails of prescription drugs. Okay, totally get that. Totally get where someone makes a decision. It's like, okay, this is taking me down a nowhere street. Let me try something different. He tried something that I didn't necessarily believe was medical at the time. But when you look at the evidence, he had gotten rid of all those drugs, prescription drugs. He was using medical cannabis. He had better function. He had a better quality of life. He had better control of his pain. Two doctors looked at it and go, we agree, it's reasonable and necessary. And the civil court says, yep, then because it's reasonable and necessary, then work comp has to reimburse it. That, to me, that whole logic train started to go, well, maybe there's something more to this, because two doctors, first importantly, Greg Villalpando said it was appropriate, then two doctors said it was appropriate, and then a court of law said it was appropriate. So it hit all three levels of healthcare, right? The individual patient, the providers who were providing it, and then the court system, the work comp system, that would say, yay or nay whether reimbursing for it. And so I started digging into it, and then I started to uncover the concept of endocannabinoid system, which the vast majority of doctors don't know about, much less individuals. But just like the mu receptors for opioids, we have an endocannabinoid system with CB1 and CB2 receptors in our brain, in our gut, in our respiratory system, along our spine. And once you started to understand that there was this endocannabinoid system that is a part of the human body that accepts cannabinoids that we generate ourselves by what we eat, what we drink, what we consume, but also can be, extended by, the cannabis plant, the hemp plant, the THC, the CBD, and you understand where the CB1 and CB2 receptors are, then all of a sudden you understand why these anecdotal stories of someone who can handle their Parkinson's now with CBD oil, now it makes sense because it's a neurological disease and you got CB1 and CB2 receptors in your brain. When you see, medical cannabis programs that include irritable bowel syndrome, it's like, how in the world does that have anything to do with it? Well, when you understand the CB1 and CB2 receptors in your gut, then you start to understand how that could be valuable. When you understand the endocannabinoid system, the entire purpose for the ECS is homeostasis. It's kind of the thermostat for the entire body. Its purpose is to make sure that the body is working in concert with one another. Your organs are working together with your cardiovascular system, which is working with your five senses. With, everything is working in balance. So if those things get out of balance, then you become pain. You generate pain. You generate anxiety. You generate depression. You generate IBS. So when I started digging into it, those air quotes around medical cannabis, I got rid of them air quotes altogether. It's like, well, there is medical appropriateness. And then when you started to dig through, the Controlled Substances Act and President Nixon adding marijuana to Schedule 1, but then you start digging under the covers and realize that was a political decision.
Sure.
Nixon, who didn't like what was happening in Berkeley with all the hippies out there. And he said, I'm going to put it as Schedule 1. Schedule 1 says there's no medical benefit to it. Well, when you see these stories, when you start seeing random controlled trials out of Israel, out of China, out of Argentina, out of Uruguay, out of Canada, out of Mexico, out of the United States, now that there are other providers of cannabis for testing besides the University of Mississippi. Once you start understanding all of that stuff, now it starts to come together. And so that's where I sit right now, and this is my personal opinion, that cannabis is medicinal. It's been medicinal for thousands of years. It was treated as a Schedule 1 criminalized drug for political reasons. And states are starting to recognize the fact that anecdote and science validates that cannabis can be medicinal. Is it appropriate for everybody? No. Is virtual reality therapy appropriate for everybody? No. Is Oxycontin appropriate for everybody? No. Is cognitive behavioral therapy? I could go on forever, right?
Right.
None of these things are appropriate for everybody. But for some people, it helps with anxiety. It helps with depression. It helps with pain. It helps with Parkinson's. It helps with epileptic seizures, which was one of the little kids with epileptic seizures, which is what really drove the adoption of states to encourage the legalization within that state of medical cannabis. So when you put all those pieces together, it validates what I saw in 2014 with these three layers of the healthcare system: the patient, the doctor, and the payer, all coming to an agreement that this made sense for this particular person. What I had to do is I had to take away the stigma. I've never smoked it. I'm not a personal fan of it. I probably won't ever eat a gummy bear or overdose on a brownie in Colorado on a weekend trip. That's just not my thing. So I had to remove that stigma and make it objective, look at it objectively, set my personal opinions or biases or whatever aside, and look at it purely head on. And that's where the air quotes went away. And, as I talked about it, as I brought up these things that people hadn't really even realized, the endocannabinoid system, again, was not taught, and I don't even think is taught even now in medical schools predominantly. So this whole concept that we've got a system within our but every human being has this endocannabinoid system was like to a lot of doctors, like, we got what?
Yeah.
So, we got all these hidden gems in our body that helps with homeostasis and all that. So, as I talked about it, people started going, I hadn't thought of it that way. And that's really been my focus, is to talk about stuff that I think has, legitimacy to it, and tease it out and let people make their own decisions. Like cognitive behavioral therapy. I talked about CBT. I think me and Michael Copeland were the only two people that were talking about CBT in the public domain in 2011, 2012. I learned a lot from Michael in regards to that. Most people would not reimburse for CBT at all, because they really felt like that was going to open up, a psychological Pandora's box. In fact, I actually spoke at a Georgia work comp conference in 2016, I believe it was, and I was talking about the benefits of CBT. And a friend of mine was sitting in the audience at a table with two work comp executives, and he overheard one lean to the other and say, "Why would we do that when drugs are so cheap?" Wow. I'm really glad I didn't hear that comment, because I probably out there and made it on the evening news, because that's just so small-minded of those. And those were people in leadership in the work comp industry that go, no, we can throw drugs at it because they're cheaper. And oh, by the way, we really don't want to go down that path of maybe open up all these squishy stuff like, what happened to them as a child, the adverse childhood experiences, that have an effect on people's resilience. So, I've just been agitating and educating, my other tagline, in order to get people to think about things differently, to set their biases aside and to think about things objectively and then come to their own conclusion. I'm not, demanding anybody agree with me whatsoever.
So Mark, one of the, as I indicated from the outset, that the reason why your name came up, it came up for a variety of reasons, but Claire mentioned you as someone really pivotal for her as a mentor. And I wanted to, I guess, ask the same question to you. Who is a mentor? Who are some mentors in the work comp industry for you personally? And what are your thoughts on mentorship and what that means to you and possibly a younger generation looking to get into workers' compensation?
Well, I've had a number of mentors, starting with my parents, starting with my first boss at Pizza Pan Restaurant at 13 years old, starting with my first manager at Equifax back in 1980, then continuing on to the original owner of Priam, who I spent a lot of time on nights and weekends sharing kind of life lessons and business lessons. So, my whole life has been filled with mentors. And I think, if everybody's honest with themselves, mentorship doesn't start with when you get your first job or,
Sure.
15 years into your tenure. From the moment that you're born, you're mentored. But there are a number of people in work comp. I learned a lot from Claire. There's this concept called reverse mentoring, where the mentor, which in theory is the person that's older or more experienced, is imparting wisdom, from on high, come down with the 10 commandments, all that kind of stuff. They're imparting all their wisdom to the mentee, and the mentee is just a sponge. Well, I've always, thought that I can learn as much, that it should be a mutually beneficial relationship, and that I can learn as much from the mentee as they're potentially learning from me. That has happened when I teach. Regardless of what I'm teaching, I tend to learn more from preparing to teach and actually presenting what I've learned, as opposed to maybe my audience who's picking up some things. And so this concept of reverse mentoring, I've learned from a variety of people. Claire certainly is one of the most driven people I think I've ever met in my entire life, and has just a different perspective on things. Stuart Colburn was a big mentor of mine. In fact, the reason why I first started public speaking is I saw him. He's an attorney in Texas with Down Stanford. He was a very outspoken proponent of managing the opioids, the overprescribing of opioids. And I saw him speak and just was overwhelmed with, okay, he's not a clinician, but he's speaking with a sense of authority and such an entertaining. And I went up to him afterwards and had the sweaty palms. It was like I was meeting Mick Jagger or like, man, and he was just so kind and so accommodating. And we've had a friendship ever since then. And he helped me through, a lot of different personal things, a lot of different professional things. There's just been a whole number of people, that I've learned through from the industry. Physicians like Dr. Mel Pohl out in Las Vegas, who introduced the concept motion is lotion to me, and just really impart. Dr. Geraldine Datz, behavioral psychologist out of Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, who really imparted a lot of information in regards to the importance of the brain and how you manage pain. Dr. Jerry Stanley, the medical director for Harvard MedTech, I only known him for a year or so, but the conversations we have on a biweekly basis just kind of blow my mind and continue to kind of expand my thought. So I'm one of those sponges. I like to be a mentor. I like to impart my wisdom. But I think I like more listening to other people. In fact, the best, when I know that my conversation has been beneficial, is when I talk the least and know less about me than I know about them at the end, because it's active listening. It's helping them talk through. And number of conversations I've had where people had the idea, they already knew what the solution was. They almost just need to say it out loud. They needed to articulate what they knew inside. I didn't add any value to them. I was just that sounding board that allowed them to speak to what the problem was and to find their own solution. And so, I think that's what mentoring is. It's a mutually beneficial growth opportunity. It's the mentor that's able to help the mentee to learn some lessons, not the hard way, and to, be encouraged that this isn't the end. This is an opportunity. This is a beginning. But also from a mentor standpoint, to be able to learn from the mentee and to set maybe your ego aside and think that this is someone who's older imparting wisdom to someone who's younger, that they're in some kind of subservient. No, this is peers. These are two people talking, whether it's business, whether it's at the grocery store, whether it's whatever it is. You talk with people as peers. You don't talk down to them, and you don't really talk up to them. This is a conversation between two human beings. And so I think, good mentoring takes that into account, that the sharing of information and the growth really come from both directions. And a good mentoring relationship means that both people have learned something that they can apply to their lives, both personal and professional, that's going to make them better.
But folks like you and Claire have done so much, in my opinion, for the industry. And I think part of it is your intellectual curiosity about the particular niches you're in, your overt passion for the subject, and the positive attitude that you bring. I think of folks like you and Claire and certainly some others that I don't mean to leave out, but I also think about where's the next RX professor, and what can we do as an industry, as a workers' compensation industry, to attract younger talent, because we're not going to be around forever. At least some of the studies and the data seems to indicate that seasoned, whether it's a desk level claims adjuster or manager, or we're losing some domain knowledge to retirement. And I think the pandemic kind of exacerbated that and maybe sped it up a little bit. But what can we do? What is your opinion on how we can make this industry more attractive to younger folks, to bring them in?
Well, that's precisely why I helped co-found the Transitions. And just for those that are listening, the transitions.org, go to that website. I co-founded it with Claire. I also co-founded it, one of our co-founders, Melissa Coleman.
Yep.
With you at Ametros, and she's been just a wonderful kind of that millennial kind of perspective on that. Ametros has been a strong advocate for the transitions. Porter Leslie, your CEO, is on our mentoring program advisory council. So we did 11 webinars in 2021 on things such as reimagining management style, reimagining human resources, reimagining communication style. Marcus Torbert, who used to be your CEO, now chairman, led one on business. We just talked about a variety of things. Technology. Barry Bloom did one on business processes. My personal passion, so we all took kind of one thing. My personal passion was mentoring. Not a huge surprise there. And so our webinar on mentoring had some really great conversations about that. And then we launched the mentoring program, which connects mentors to mentees. And so we've been continuing to build that up. We've got burgeoning relationships with a couple of universities, with some charitable organizations that hopefully in the near term we'll be able to talk about. Some organizations that have internship programs that are part of the onboarding process. They're going to connect them to a mentor and a mentee. One of the things to your question about who's the next RX professor, there's a bunch of people out there. And I think one of the silver linings for COVID is a democratization of content. Number one, a lot of people that would never be allowed to spend the money to go to a conference were allowed to spend an hour and $49 for free for a webinar. So there's been a lot of people, and I've spoken to a lot of conference organizers, that their attendance actually has doubled, tripled, because people are able to attend that never would be able to go there. So there've been a lot of people that have been exposed to content that they would never have been able to expose to before. And secondly, and I think maybe most importantly, is that we have developed new voices because everybody and his brother had a webinar, everybody and his brother had a podcast, everybody and his brother had X, Y, and Z. And so you couldn't ask Mark to speak 7 times a week,
right,
2 weeks a year to fill that content. So it forced people to find other folks that had expertise, that had professionalism, that could articulate a message that was personally, important to them, professionally, et cetera. And so that next generation of RX professors, of Claire's, of Stuart Colburn's, of Bill Zachary's, of Bob Wilson's, of Mark Wall's, of Joe Peduta's, all these kind of legacy folks that have been there and kind of done that for a while. That's next generation of the people that can be in the spotlight. We've exposed over the past 2 years. And so, I have purposefully backed off of some opportunities to speak and I've redirected them to people that I know, because it's time to pass the torch, to borrow a phrase, and our logo for the transitions is pass the torch. It's time to give, to allow that democratization that happened organically over the past 2 years to actually take hold. And for people to have keynote presentations that you've never heard of, but they get up on the stage and they may be younger than you, they may be a different ethnicity or color than you, they may be a different gender than you, they may be in a different organization than you, but you sit back and listen and go, holy crap, I never thought of it that way. And it enables all of us to expand our knowledge, from hearing those different perspectives. And so, that's my hope, is that the last 2 years have exposed some of the, we've scraped away kind of the old curmudgeonly red clay, to borrow, the terrain from Georgia. And we're getting more to kind of the granite of that next generation. It's going to be really the foundation of our industry for the next decades.
I'm really excited for that. And just want to, on behalf of the industry, if I can do that, just really thank you for what you've done. I really feel that some of the unique ideas that you've brought to the forefront have benefited people's lives in a really positive way, have changed the way practitioners and providers think about taking care of people, and frankly, probably saved a lot of lives too. It's a pretty selfless thing that you did, all based upon your passion for these ideas. And I can't wait to see what the next thing is. And I just appreciate it very much. So with that, it's settled. That was the RX Professor. I want to thank you very much, Mark. It's been awesome. Can't wait to have you back on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Sean, for the invitation. And it means a lot coming from you, because you're a very thoughtful person. Praise from you means a lot, because it's selective. You don't hand it out. You don't hand it out in broad strokes. You hand it out to people who really deserve it. So I really appreciate your thoughts on my place in the industry. I'm not dead yet, and I have a lot more to give. So hopefully you'll be continuing to hear from me, along with the next generation that has lots of great things to say. So thank you so much, Sean, for inviting me to your podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thanks for joining us for this episode of It's Settled, the Ametros podcast. For more information and episodes, you can visit us at our website at ametros.com. That's ametros.com. Or head over to iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. We hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to sharing more stories of people overcoming their workplace accidents and bodily injury claims, and those who are working hard to make a difference for them. So it's settled. We'll see you next time.